Hello everyone and welcome to the first coffee chat of the year. It's lovely to see so many of you here today, both some new faces and a lot of old hats. My name is Mari Rustan and I'm the Marketing Director and Product Manager of IrisBG. Eyvind Rustan, who's the founder and CEO of IrisBG, is also here today. So today we will hear from Zinnia Cheetham, the Plant Records Curator Specialist at Morris Country Park Commission. She will share how she was able to uncover a significant loss of trees and how this data was used to increase funding and engagement across several interest points. She has a set of questions that we will have a look at together in the smaller breakout rooms before we share our findings with the plenary. First, just a few words on the coffee chats. With this format, we would like to offer you a space where you can connect with peers and have a chat about IrisBG and the issues that may arise through the daily work with your collections. These sessions won't have a fixed format, and you as a community can influence how they will evolve. Sometimes we may have more than one challenge or perhaps a demo of IrisBG tips and tricks. So yeah, please let us know what you're interested in, if you would like to present a challenge or if you have any suggestions for improvement. Hopefully you will make some new connections and together we might become just a bit wiser. This map shows the locations of everyone that registered for today. I have not taken home offices into account, so this probably isn't fully accurate. To further learn a bit more about who's here today, I've created a tiny poll. The first question is related to your experience with IrisBG. And the second question is related to Zinnia's presentation that is coming up next. So fun to see that we as usual have all levels represented, and yeah, great to see that we have quite a few of you that have been monitoring your trees and a lot of you that are really interested to learn how to do this. So we hope that you will be inspired by Zinnia's presentation and that you can offer her some help later. So without no further ado, please welcome Zinnia and let's hear about how she was able to uncover a great loss of trees in their arboreta at Morris Country Park Commission.
Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the IrisBG Coffee Chat today. I'm so glad to be here presenting to you, and I'm excited to present my findings for this project that I completed at the end of last year. I'll be going through the process I went through so that any of you at other gardens can do a similar analysis for your collections. I'll talk a little bit about our gardens first, how I worked with our plant records data, and I'll walk you through my finding of the 350 lost trees. There will be a lot of charts for the nerds like me, but also a lot of pictures for the plant lovers on the call today. So hopefully everyone will enjoy this, and I'm looking forward to our discussion at the end. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was some quick information on our organization. The Morris County Park Commission owns and operates 3 arboreta, and these are accredited as ARBNet Level 2 arboreta since 2019. These properties were primarily acquired during the 1970s, and they all have different origins, significant features, and aesthetics. The Frelinghuysen Arboretum is primarily focused on education and was accredited as an ACS reference garden in 2021. The Bamboo Brook Outdoor Education Center is primarily focused on the historic legacy of Martha Brooks Hutchison, and it's been undergoing renovations since 2004 to update those historic gardens. And there's Martha in the photo on the right, holding some chickens and surrounded by crops during her involvement with the Women's Land Army. And the Willowwood Arboretum is known for its exotic trees, natural landscapes, and historic plant collections. Willowwood also is the most championed trees of any property in New Jersey. Combined, these diverse sites make up the largest and oldest gardens in New Jersey. And I also wanted to provide some plant records background, like I've seen other presenters do during previous coffee chats. So we've been using IrisBG since 2018 when we migrated our data over from BGBase. At that point, we split our 3 sites into 2 databases. Willowwood and Bamboo Brook were formerly one property, and they're still managed by the same shared staff. So we kept those records together and just used location codes to distinguish the records for each site. All of our records for Frelinghuysen are then stored in a separate database, and those accessions have a letter F as the prefix to distinguish the accession numbers from those in the other database and collections. Currently, the plant records for all 3 sites are managed solely by me, the plant records curator specialist. And for one season, we had a plant records assistant for 6 months, and she's on the call today. So I want to give her a shout out to say thank you for her help. We also didn't have any plants mapped when we migrated our data to the new database, but now we're at 80% of our collections mapped. I also have our current plant collection statistics that I generated for our year-end report. So anyone who's interested can take a look at those. And for my annual year-end report, I usually just look at our new accessions, but something I've been thinking about for a few years is taking a look at our total collections. And I think the idea started when I was at a plant records conference in Vancouver a few years ago. And one presenter from Australia mentioned that they had analyzed their collection to see the age of their trees in order to see how mature their collection was. So one element that I wanted to look at in my project were the age of the trees to see how many had survived from different time periods and what the age of our current collections was. This also made me think about how to interpret the significance of what I found. What I realized was I couldn't really interpret our living data without also looking at the data for what has died. For example, if 5 trees are alive that are from 1950, while 200 that are the same age are dead, that tells me something very different than if 5 trees are alive while only 5 that are the same age are dead. So I decided to look at all of our tree data that had a known accession year, and I was able to chart how many trees from different planting periods are still alive or have died over time. I also included some assumptions and expectations I had when I started this presentation on this slide. We all work with living collections, so we could assume that most trees will eventually mature, become old, start to deteriorate, and then they would be removed as an old tree. So in the records, we would expect that the living accessions would mostly be made up of younger trees and those that are still at a healthy age and stage of maturity. I also assume that we're probably planting enough trees to make up for the trees that are aging out of our collections. And on the next few slides, I'll discuss how I worked with our records in IrisBG in order to get data for this project. The first thing is that I would definitely recommend looking at your data first and cleaning up your records. I initially exported the data I wanted to look at, but found it full of errors and blanks, so I decided to clean it in the taxa and accession records in the database first. Fortunately, I've been working with our database for 4 years now, so I know the weaknesses in our data and I've been cleaning them, but there were still some blanks in our life form field that haven't been filled in, and I wanted to utilize that field to pull the data that I wanted. Since I wanted to look at data for our trees specifically, I knew if I ran a report which selected the various tree categories under the life form field, select just my tree data. So I exported a report listing all of our plants with a blank life form field and reviewed that and updated the records for any trees that were on that list. With those blanks filled in, I could now select those options for trees in the database, and all of my tree data would be selected from my report. The other data field that I had to clean in order to capture the data I wanted was the material type. So I began with an advanced search for all of our trees in the accession record and reviewed their material type. This was an important field because I wanted to know which trees had a known history and their accession number represented the year of their planting. The other option was that they might have been found on the site as a mature tree and added to the records as an existing tree with a much later accession year that didn't correspond to when it was planted. Since I wanted to look at their approximate ages, I really needed to know when they were planted. So our data for material type was all over the place. What I found was that it might say it was unknown, but then say that it was actually received as a 5-foot B&B with a nursery source in the comment section, or it might say it was received as a plant when it was actually an existing tree. So I really had to sit down and flip through the records to just get the data we had correctly entered into that field. Once that was done, I was able to look over my data and found that it was now clean and ready to work with. The next step was to export the data into Excel, and that was easily done using the report tool in Iris. And you may want to make a custom report template for this, and if so, below are some of the lists of the fields I found helpful to export for this project. I always export our identifying plant information, including the accession number, plant taxonomy information. We also need the location codes to sort our data by site because ours were combined. And I've emphasized several that I found useful since I used the accession year to calculate an approximate age for our living accessions. And I used the last item status date for non-living data, and that was used to see what year the tree was removed. And I did change the status date from a day, month, year format to just a year to make it easier to work with. And the next step was filtering the data. Earlier, I mentioned that I didn't want to include trees that were added to the record as mature trees and those with an unknown origin. So those that were considered existing trees were filtered out using material type, and they were removed from the data set. We also have records for unplanted trees in the nursery, plants in containers, and plants in indoor greenhouse spaces that aren't open to the public. So I wanted to remove those and just focus on our living collections that are permanently planted and on display to the public. And I also found several records with null data for the year, as you can see with the 0000. So I pulled those as well. And overall, the data was in good shape at this point, but it was good to look over all of those details like that and really look at the data. So that's how I got my data set. And the next we'll start looking at my findings. And this is just how I chose to do it. So this is a good starting point for other gardens. And of course, you may want to make some changes. We'll be having a discussion period at the end. So if you've started thinking about other data you want to include, other directions you'd want to go with this, feel free to jot that down, because I know that my idea for this project started with a presentation I saw. So I think that'd be great if this inspires some other ideas. So once the data was exported for each site, I decided to look at some basic statistics first. You can see for each site that I looked at the oldest and youngest records to see how many years our collection spans. I also set up a basic formula to subtract the accession year from the current year to calculate the age of each tree and find the average at each site. I've also included the numbers for how many trees were used in my final analysis after all of the cleaning and the filtering. So with this information, we can see that Willowwood has the oldest recorded trees with an average tree age that's nearly double that of Frelinghuysen, and it also has the widest age range. There are also the most tree records for Willowwood, which makes sense since we were actively maintaining plant records there since 1910, while record keeping started the other sites once they were being managed by the Morris County Park Commission, and that was in the 1970s. And since we have 3 sites, it's a bit interesting to compare. And it was a bit of a Goldilocks situation when I looked at the data. The records for Willowwood were the oldest and the broadest. The records for Bamboo Brook were the smallest and the youngest. And Frelinghuysen was just right in the middle. So this was a helpful way to see the differences between our sites and start to answer my initial questions. So using this data, I was able to generate some graphs to look at the age of our trees like I'd wanted to and compare how many trees were accessioned during each of these periods and were still alive or dead. So this chart shows the living trees at Willowwood in green and the non-living trees at Willowwood in gray during 5-year intervals. And this was interesting for me to look at and see different things, such as the many living accessions that still exist from 1910 to the 1914 period. And I wonder if this is related to record keeping or if it could indicate that the staff value and are engaging with the older accessions for preservation, since this was a time period with more living than dead, and that did not happen again all the way until we get to 2005 to 2009. There's also a huge number of both living and dead trees recorded between 1950 to 1980. So there's a lot of tree planting during this period, but we can see it started to drop as we entered the 80s. And this was interesting because the Morris County Park Commission took control of the operations of the site in 1980, and the last original family member passed away in 1987. So this decline following this period of high tree planting probably relates to a change in management. And when looking at the data for just living trees, it spread pretty evenly throughout each time period until the 1990s, when we see the majority of living trees recorded, which is roughly what I'd expected. So a large amount of our current trees are from the last 30 years. And I also wanted to know that a large number of donations were received in 2018, and a buffer of trees was planted near a fence line in 2019. So we can see how that one donation event and tree planting project contributed to an abnormally large number of new trees during the 2015 to 2019 range. So this was generally what I expected my data to look like, although there are some interesting aspects of the data that I learned and saw through this chart as well. But this isn't all that I wanted to show you today. I decided to dig a little deeper, and that's when things really started to get interesting. What I decided to do next was look at what's happening each year and look at when we were removing these trees. Because this chart is looking at survival. It answers the question, how many trees from this or that time period are still alive? But it doesn't tell me when these trees are being removed, and I wanted a better sense of what's going on in our current collections. So that led me to comparing how many trees were being planted each year to how many trees were being removed each year. So for this chart, the data comes from looking at the number of trees removed in a year and subtracting that from the number of trees being planted that year at the 3 arboreta. And this gave me a net quantity of trees being planted each year in the gardens as a whole. And you'll notice that this chart starts in 2004, since that's when I had the accessions recorded for all of our sites. And I also removed 3 outliers from this graph that were present due to deaccessioning some trees in natural unmanaged areas. So that's why those years are missing on the x-axis. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'd like to show you what we're looking at. And first, I want to point out this red line right by the 0. So the 0 is where we would be net 0, which means we're planting as many trees as we're removing with no growth or no loss. Anything above that line is positive, which means we planted more than we removed. Anything below that line is negative, which means we have removed more than we have planted. So looking at this data, going back about 2 decades at the arboreta, it's clear that we've removed more trees than we've planted because all of our data is below the line except for in 2018, which is the only year that crosses the red line. And this is a pretty persistent trend to have lasted since 2004. And then looking at the present day, since the COVID-19 pandemic began in 2020, the budget for plants was greatly reduced, and we can see a steady decline in the rate of tree replacement as planting went down and tree removals continued. So this is where I realized that looking at the difference between trees being planted and trees being removed tells us a lot more about our gardens than just a static picture of their longevity. And unfortunately, what that told me is that our gardens are in decline. So now I'm getting concerned by what I found in that last chart. So I'm going to take a closer look at what's been happening recently and zoom in on the last 10 years to look at current trends. So this chart shows the same data, but only since 2012, and it shows it slightly differently. Here you can see the living tree planting data in green, and you can see the non-living removals for each year in gray. And this is another great way to visually compare the difference. And you can see that the green bar is much longer than the gray in 2018, when we had more trees planted than removed. But for the past 3 years, that has reversed, and our removals in gray are increasing while the number of trees being planted, our green bars, are decreasing. And I also wanted to look at our different gardens to see how each were impacted, and that data is on the left. On average for the last decade, I found that Willowwood and Frelinghuysen were planting trees at almost the same rate, but that Willowwood is removing the most trees. Bamboo Brook also had a much lower rate of planting and removals, but the rate of removal was still twice that of planting. And these numbers were useful to calculate so that we have an average to work with to answer a new question. If we're removing more trees than we're planting, how many more should we be planting on average to break even or to reverse this trend? And these are our graphs by site. Since we have 3 sites, it's worthwhile to look at the differences between them, and these include all data, including outliers since 2004. I thought I'd include them since each site is unique, and it starts to show the different stories for each site. And I'm sure your garden will have its own story as well. So what I found was that each garden did have slightly different graphs, but all were negative for the majority of the years. And you can see that we had spikes on each of our charts where our outliers were. And upon further investigation, I had found that Willowwood and Frelinghuysen's outliers were due to record-keeping cleanup, more so than actual plant removals. But the spike at Bamboo Brook was due to a massive planting project following a major historic garden renovation in 2009. And while it's great to have something positive on the graph, this growth makes me cautious, since if the majority of our trees were planted at the same time, then it's likely that they all mature and decline around the same time, which isn't good when that's the majority of the collection. It's also interesting to note the growth of the collection at Bamboo Brook actually declined in the following years. So we had this boom-bust cycle of the garden and very low rates of growth, which makes the collection seem pretty precarious. Then if we look at Frelinghuysen next, that site had 7 net 0 or positive years, and we can see that there was a period where growth was positive and consistent from about 2015 to 2018. However, it suddenly dropped in 2019 and then has declined quickly in the last 2 years. And this really caught my attention and indicates that recent changes could be looked at and addressed to bring that rate back up. And last, I'd like to look at the graph for Willowwood. The outliers I mentioned previously are the most prominent feature of our chart, but it's also striking that only 1 year was positive during the entire period that I analyzed, and that was due to a large donation of trees by an individual and not the actions of the Park Commission. So without that donation, it would have been negative every year. So that would be the site I'm most concerned about. Historically, Willowwood has had the most champion trees, exotic species, and the most tree collections of our arboreta. And we're losing that. And I didn't know that, and no one working here knew that. And I'd gotten a hint of it when I nominated our champion trees and saw that 50 had died since they were originally nominated in the 1990s, and only 20 had been nominated in their place. And I got another hint when we had a tree that was featured on a tour break in a storm. So when I looked in the records to record the removal, I saw that it was the only specimen of that species in our collections. So we had just lost some of the diversity among our taxa. So I'd seen hints of the decline, and that was just while I was doing my work. But I had no idea we had for 2 decades been reducing our collections instead of growing it. And while it's easy to assume that our collections are doing fine, they must be growing, it was pretty wild to actually see the data on our botanical collections and realize that our gardens are all in decline. It was at about this point that I realized I wanted to talk about this with staff at other gardens. It made me wonder, are these trends normal for gardens our age or for gardens that are part of a park system? And what would be a reasonable standard to strive for based on the size of our gardens or the size of our staff? So I really do hope this talk encourages others to do this analysis, both for their garden, for their benefit from knowing what trends are for growth are happening in their collection, but also so that we can create a conversation around this, because I don't know the answers to those questions. And it's pretty cool that we have 3 sites, so I can compare them together, but it'd be even better to get outside of our bubble and see what's happening at other gardens. So for the last few slides, I've talked about what we've seen in the last decade at our arboreta. And what we've seen are these trends that have really existed for the last 2 decades and don't show signs of improving. So what happens if they don't change? Based on the numbers from the last decade, we had a 14.75% loss of trees in the collection. And here's what that looks like over the next several decades. In 80 years, we could lose nearly 1,500 trees. And just looking back at the last decade and counting up the difference, I found that we had planted 255 trees, but we had removed 352 more trees than we had planted. And that was pretty shocking to realize that we had lost, or that we had 350 less trees and no one had noticed. And because no one knew, no one was doing anything about it. And now this might be our future. And while I was working on this project, I remembered something a former staff member had mentioned to me. They said that we had a policy, and so that for every tree that was removed, the park commission was supposed to replant one. So I tracked down the policy and saw that it was implemented in 2011. This means that those 352 trees that had been removed should have been replaced, and that would have been aligned with the goals of the park commission. But remember how I said I omitted the existing trees? If we add those in, I've recorded 585 trees that were removed in the last 10 years since this policy went into effect. In addition, I have some documentation for tree removal projects where ash trees were being removed due to emerald ash borer. We had some red pines in decline that were removed, and some dead trees in our natural areas were removed. So if I add in all those trees too, since they all count as a tree that was removed from parkland, then we're over 807 trees. So the true number of trees lost is much greater than my estimates, which were already concerning to me. And what's strange is that we had a policy in place that was approved and supposedly put into effect to prevent this exact situation. So this made me wonder if our policies could be more effective or if the implementation of this policy could be improved. For example, by dedicating funds in the budget for each site, by creating a fund for just tree replacement funds for all the parks, or assigning a monitoring role to a staff member who's actively engaging in collecting this data and presenting this data every year. So this analysis made me wonder if I should be more engaged with monitoring tree removals when a tree isn't in our accession collection. I've had staff mention to me that a tree was removed, and when I follow up with questions, they tell me that, oh, the tree was in a session, so they hadn't bothered telling me. But now that I'm looking at calculating how many trees we've lost at the sites as a whole, that creates some ambiguity because I may not have gotten the relevant information in each case. So we'll loop back to that in our discussion at the end of our talk. So feel free to jot down your thoughts now if you have something you want to share at the end. And some of you might think that this isn't applicable to you because you're confident that you have an amazing, robust collection, and that's wonderful. But I'd still argue that it may be worthwhile to do this analysis. And potentially, there's really only 3 outcomes. Perhaps you're part of a new or expanding garden. When I was working at Stoneleigh, we were planting dozens, if not hundreds of trees every year in the gardens, and we were in a period of rapid development. And I was blown away by how much coastal Maine botanic gardens had expanded between my first visit and my most recent visit. And I would assume that gardens like that, which are expanding and planting large planting projects, would have a positive rate. But wouldn't your marketing team want to know about that? And if you're a nonprofit, wouldn't it be worthwhile to mention that to your donors? Or what if you use this information to determine your average rate of tree loss and make sure you're budgeting for the amount? That way you can buy replacement trees to keep up with that positive rate. So even if you aren't concerned and haven't had hints of stagnation like I did, it may be worth the effort to do this analysis. And some gardens could be sustaining their collections at roughly net zero. I would think this would be similar to Bamboo Brook, where a small garden has less loss, but it's also experiencing less growth. For a garden at net zero, it's definitely worthwhile to keep an eye on your numbers because while it could improve, it's very easy for that to drop like we saw with COVID-19 pandemic at Frelinghuysen, or with emerald ash borer, or spotted lanternfly, or natural disasters that could quickly change. And the last option is that you would be like us and that you would find a problem that you weren't aware of or that you at least didn't have quantified in these charts and numbers. Then once you have the data, you can start a conversation. So I've been invited to share this information with our county commissioners who control our budget and make the case for increasing the funding for trees at our arboreta. So I'm hoping now we can set informed targets for the amount of trees we need to plant each year. And I've already seen my director and our education department start advocating for trees and tree planting efforts since I gave my initial presentation to our staff. So now we can start looking for a solution. Now that we can see the problem, we can reach for a common goal. While it may seem bad to have a negative rate, I'd argue that's the most useful, and the data is really valuable in getting attention for this issue. And why is this important? We're literally an arboreta. Our gardens were created with the intention of growing trees for the public. So this is the basis for educational programs which bring people of all ages back to nature. We see birders every day at our sites because our plants provide resources and ecological value as habitat. We have about 25% of all recorded champion trees in New Jersey at our sites. So we should be replanting trees for future generations that they can admire as they grow into impressive specimens like we have today. And shouldn't we be setting an example by planting trees? And I wanted to share just a short personal anecdote. In the neighborhood where I grew up, the houses were built and the street trees planted at the same time, around the 1950s. So it was a bit like Bamboo Brook, where everything's pretty much the same age. And I lived there for 20 years and watched as the trees were aging and the neighbors were cutting them down, and they were not replacing them. So after all, why would they want to clean up trees or worry about branches falling on the wires, or maybe they didn't know how to pick and plant a tree? For whatever reason, this trend continued throughout my neighborhood. So by the time I was an adult walking my dog in my early 20s, I found that we couldn't walk on warm, sunny days because it was so hot and oppressive without the shade of the mature street trees. And it was also depressing to see all the stumps instead of the acorns, the samaras, the fall color, even weird cankers, all those things that interest us and that we look for in trees and that we still look for today. I would hate to see the public come to these beautiful gardens and to see stumps instead of the beauty. And this all doesn't just apply to gardens. We're an arboretum, but this can be an issue at other situations, like in my neighborhood, your community, your parks, at a zoo, anywhere where you have trees. And on this note, this past weekend, I took this photo at a park in the town where I currently live. So in the background are 5 fresh stumps from ash trees, which were removed as part of the county's response to emerald ash borer. Dozens of ash trees were removed from the park for the safety of the visitors. And that reminded me how at the Arboreta, we have a commemorative tree program and a commemorative bench program. Currently, the benches are more popular than the commemorative trees at the Arboretum, and we had about half a dozen purchased last year. And they're lovely benches. But do you want to sit on a bench next to a bunch of stumps on a hot day? And because we have a commemorative tree program, we have only a few inquiries into that program. And when we do receive a request, the memorial is typically placed on an existing tree and no new trees are planted. So our tree planting program has the potential to encourage and support tree planting initiatives, but currently we're looking at the benches and not the trees in the gardens around the benches. And this may be something that other gardens could contribute their feedback on as well, since I'll be initiating this discussion with our organization, and it'd be beneficial for me to be able to bring experience of other gardens into the conversation and highlight some tools that have worked for others. And I'd love to hear if you had some successes related to preserving or maintaining trees in your collections, and if you're using programs or policies to do so. I'm going to do my best to convey this information, and I started by starting with our staff, our director, and our friends groups, and as plant recorder, I'll be recording this and monitoring it every year. But I'm hoping that our management team and our stakeholders will be able to bring this conversation to a new level. And then we could take coordinated action on this. Because I think everyone in our organization would agree that we don't want our gardens to look like what we're seeing in this photo. And I know this presentation has been a bit heavy and a bit technical. So for levity, here's some images that the public has taken at our arboreta. We can see the bark on our gorgeous fernleaf beech. We can see our champion photinia, horse chestnut in bloom, a beautiful shot of our champion metasequoia, our lilac collection, the original waterfall Japanese maple, which all waterfalls are progeny of, our champion Salix matsudana, our cherry collection in front of the mansion at Frelinghuysen, and a flowering cherry in our cottage garden. And I think it's pretty cool how our trees actually inspired art, whether it's the photographer who captured this beautiful light, or how perfectly this woman's dress matches the trees, or the unusual pose of this couple over here. No matter how much and how many numbers I present, you just can't quantify the true value of a tree. So I can try, but I think these photos help show the value that I can't measure. So that is the end of my presentation today, and I thank you all for your patience and attendance today. I'm so glad I had the opportunity to share this with you, and I thank all the staff at IrisBG for the opportunity as well. Hopefully this has gotten you thinking about your organization and you found something relevant here that has resonated with you. And like I said, I would love to hear from people about whether about your questions that you may have or the results that you may find with your gardens. So don't hesitate to reach me at my email address. And if you liked my photos, I've been posting them on Instagram at Willowwood Arboretum Foundation ever since we got locked down and the gardens were briefly closed in 2020. And we also have an official account for the 3 arboreta at Morris County Gardens on Instagram.